We begin with clay. Mesopotamia, circa 3300 BCE. The earliest written records we possess are not poetry, not philosophy, not the names of kings or the stories of gods. They are receipts, barley delivered, sheep counted, oil measured and stored. The first words we can read are accounts of things already moving through an established system. The writing assumes the existence of temples, of administrators, of storage facilities, of social hierarchies, complex enough to require written memory. History does not begin at the beginning. It begins in the middle. This is the first fracture we must acknowledge. When we speak of human history, we are speaking of approximately 5,000 years. 5,000 years of text, of names, of events we can arrange in sequence and call a narrative. But anatomically, modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Let that ratio settle for a moment. If we compressed human existence into a single year, everything we call history would occupy the final 6 days of December. The pyramids would be built on December 29th. Rome would fall on December 31st at 6 p.m. The Renaissance would begin at 11:30 p.m. on New Year's Eve. And everything before December 26th? Silence. Not absence. Silence. We are accustomed to thinking of history as a record of what happened, but it is more accurate to think of it as a record of what survived. And survival is a physical process. Stone survives. Under the right conditions, pottery survives. Metal corrodes but leaves traces. Bone can fossilize if buried quickly in the right sediment. But wood rots. Fiber disintegrates. Leather returns to the soil. Anything organic becomes food for bacteria, for fungi, for the chemical appetite of oxygen and water. The past does not fade like a photograph left in sunlight. It is actively consumed. Time is not a neutral backdrop. It is an agent of erasure. Consider what we know about Göbekli Tepe. Southeast Turkey, carved into bedrock around 9,600 BCE. Massive stone pillars, some weighing 16 tons, arranged in circles, decorated with reliefs of animals. Scorpions, foxes, vultures, serpents. It was built by hunter-gatherers. This is not supposed to happen. In the standard narrative, complex architecture requires agriculture, which creates surplus, which enables specialization, which allows for monumental construction. But Göbekli Tepe precedes agriculture by 1,000 years. The sequence is broken. Either our model of development is incomplete, or Göbekli Tepe is not the beginning of something. It is the middle, or the end. The stone tells us nothing about what came before it. Stone only tells us about itself. This is the inheritance problem. We inherit ruins, but not reasons. We inherit consequences, but not contexts. We inherit a planet that has been shaped by activity we cannot see. Forests are not natural. The Amazon rainforest, which we imagine as primordial wilderness, bears the marks of extensive cultivation. Terra preta, enriched black soil, full of charcoal and pottery fragments, covers vast areas. Someone engineered that soil. Someone managed those orchards. The Sahara was green 6,000 years ago. Grassland, lakes, human settlements that we now find buried under sand. Climate changed, people moved, and the desert inherited the space. The Mediterranean coast was forested before Bronze Age shipbuilding. The cedars of Lebanon, famous in ancient texts, are nearly extinct now. The hills are bare. The ecosystem shifted because someone needed timber. We do not inherit memory. We inherit alteration. Let me propose a thought experiment. Imagine how civilization collapses tomorrow, not by nuclear war or asteroid impact, but by something subtler, a cascading failure of agricultural systems, a pandemic that reduces the population by 90%, a climate shift that makes current population centers uninhabitable. The survivors scatter, knowledge fragments. Writing becomes useless when there is no one to teach reading. 5,000 years pass. What remains? The Hoover Dam would silt up, crack, and eventually collapse. Its concrete would erode into the landscape. The steel would rust into stains in the rock. Cities would be buried under vegetation, or wind-blown soil, or the slow accumulation of organic debris. Asphalt would crack and be colonized by roots. Glass would shatter and weather into sand. The plastics might last longer, but without context, a shard of polycarbonate is just a strange rock. And the digital record, every hard drive, every server, every cloud backup requires continuous power and maintenance. Without that, data degrades within decades. The magnetic domains randomize. The flash memory leaks charge. Within 1,000 years, almost everything would be illegible. Within 5,000 years, unless you knew exactly where to dig, you might find nothing at all. This is not speculation. This is geology. We know the preservation rate of organic material in tropical environments. We know how long it takes for iron to oxidize completely. We know that even pottery, one of the most durable artifacts, becomes fragmented and unrecognizable after enough time in active soil. The archaeological record is not a faithful transcript of the past. It is a heavily edited summary where the editor is chemistry and the deadline is 10,000 years. Most of what happened leaves no trace. Most of who we were becomes soil. So when we look at the earliest written records and see them describing systems already in place, hierarchies already functioning, techniques already refined, we should ask the obvious question: what came before this? Not in the immediate sense. We know there were precursor societies. We know there was Ubaid culture before Sumer and Halaf culture before Ubaid. But what came before the chain of evidence begins? What happened in the 295,000 years before anyone wrote anything down? Were there other sequences? Other experiments in complexity that rose and fell and left no stone? Did someone else stand where we stand now, looking backward, trying to read the silence? The standard answer is no. The standard narrative says that humans were simple before the Neolithic Revolution, that we lived in small bands, followed animal migrations, gathered plants, and left no permanent mark. But this narrative is built on absence of evidence. An absence of evidence is not neutral. It is shaped by what can be preserved and what we know how to look for. We find stone tools because stone survives. We find cave paintings because caves are sheltered from erosion. We find graves because bone can fossilize. But if a society built entirely with bamboo, or lived entirely on coastlines now underwater, or organized themselves in ways that required no monumental architecture, they would be invisible to us. Not because they did not exist, because they did not leave the kind of evidence we are capable of detecting. This is the humility the geological timescale demands. We are standing on a planet that is 4.5 billion years old. Anatomically, modern humans have been here for 300,000 years. Behaviorally, modern humans, with language and abstract thought and symbolic culture, have been here for at least 70,000 years, and we have written records for 5,000. The ratio is staggering. 98% of human experience is prehistory. Not prehistory because nothing happened, but prehistory because nothing was written down in a form that survived. We are not at the beginning of the story. We are not even at the middle. We are standing on the accumulated consequences of everything that came before, most of which has been chemically returned to the earth. So here is the uncomfortable question. If we are inheritors, what did we inherit? not texts, not blueprints, not instructions. We inherited a planet that has been shaped, forests that were managed, soil that was engineered, coastlines that were occupied and are now submerged, species that were domesticated or driven to extinction. We inherited techniques without understanding their origin. Agriculture appears in multiple locations around the globe within a relatively narrow time window. Some plants, like maize, were so heavily modified by selective breeding that we cannot identify their wild ancestors. Someone did that work. Someone spent generations experimenting, selecting, propagating, but we do not have their names. We do not have their records. We have only the consequential plants that cannot reproduce without human intervention. This is inheritance without memory. The earth does not remember who changed it. The soil does not carry the names of the people who enriched it. The forest does not recall who planted its oldest trees. But the changes persist, and we, arriving later, assume we are the first to see what has always been here. We call it nature. We call it wilderness. We call it the beginning. But it is not the beginning. It is the middle. And the question we must carry forward is this: if the earth has been reshaped before, and the evidence has been erased by time, how many times has this happened? How many layers are we standing on? We will return to this. For now, sit with the silence. Sit with the 290-5,000 years before writing. Sit with the realization that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is only evidence of time. Next, we will examine the anomalies, the structures that appear too early, the technologies that seem to arrive out of sequence, the breaks in the chain that suggest something else was here before the evidence begins. But first, leave a question in the comments. Not an answer, a question. What would you build if you wanted it to survive 10,000 years? We expect the past to arrive in order. Simple tools before complex ones. Small settlements before cities. Trial and error before refinement. We expect progress to be cumulative, each generation building on the last, adding incrementally to a shared pool of knowledge. This is how we understand our own history. This is the narrative we inherited from the Enlightenment, from the Victorian confidence in linear advancement, from the assumption that time moves in one direction and complexity increases along with it. But the archaeological record does not cooperate. There are structures that appear without precedent, technologies that emerge fully formed, then vanish, capabilities that seem to arrive too early, exist for a while, then disappear for centuries before being rediscovered. The sequence is broken in multiple places, and when a sequence breaks, we are left with two possibilities. Either our understanding of the sequence is wrong, or the sequence itself is not linear. Let us examine the breaks. Göbekli Tepe, which we have already mentioned, is the most famous example. But it is not isolated. In Peru, the city of Kar-El dates to approximately 2600 BC. It is contemporary with the Egyptian Old Kingdom. It has pyramids, plazas, an amphitheater capable of holding hundreds of people, and it has no pottery. Pottery is supposed to come early. It is one of the marker technologies of settled life. You make pots to store grain, to cook food, to carry water. Pottery appears in the Neolithic, thousands of years before urbanization, but Kar-El built a city without it. They used gourds instead. Plant fiber bags, perishable containers that left almost no trace. If Kar-El had been located in a wetter climate, we would not know it existed. The city would have rotted into the jungle and left nothing but earthworks that could be mistaken for natural hills. We only found Kar-El because it was built in a desert, and deserts preserve. This raises an obvious question. How many cities did we not find? How many urban experiments happened in climates where organic materials decompose, where rain erodes, where vegetation reclaims the landscape within decades? The Amazon basin covers 5.5 million square kilometers. Ground minus penetrating radar and LIDAR have recently revealed extensive earthworks beneath the canopy. Geometric formations, causeways, evidence of large scale landscape modification. These were only discovered in the last 20 years. Before that, the Amazon was assumed to be pristine wilderness, too hostile for complex society. The soil was thought to be too poor, the environment too difficult. But the environment was not pristine. It was managed. And when the management stopped, The jungle inherited the space. How much more is still hidden? How much was built with materials that leave no trace? If a civilization built entirely with bamboo and thatch, cultivated tree orchards instead of grain fields, and used rivers instead of roads, they would be nearly invisible to archaeology, not because they were primitive, because they did not use stone. Now consider the Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901. Dated to approximately 100 BCE, it is a geared astronomical calculator. Bronze gears, some with teeth as fine as those in an 18th-century clockwork. Differential gears, which allowed inputs to be combined into a single output. A system complex enough to predict the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, as well as eclipses, years in advance. Nothing remotely this sophisticated appears again in the historical record until the 14th century, 1400 years. This is not a gap in preservation. This is a gap in capability. The Antikythera mechanism was not a prototype. It was a finished instrument, made by someone who understood gear ratios, EPI cyclic motion, and the mathematics of planetary cycles, which means there were earlier versions, simpler designs, failed attempts, a tradition of instrument minus making that had been refined over time. But we have none of those. No predecessors, no duplicates, no evidence of workshops that produced such devices. Just one corroded lump of bronze, pulled from the seafloor by sponge divers who had no idea what they had found. If that ship had sunk in deeper water, or if the mechanism had corroded completely, we would not know it was possible. We would assume geared calculators were a medieval invention, and we would be wrong by more than a millennium. This is the inheritance problem in its sharpest form. Knowledge is not automatically passed down. It is passed down through practice, through teaching, through institutions that survive long enough to transmit expertise. When institutions collapse, knowledge fragments. Skills that took generations to develop can be lost in a single lifetime. You can inherit a tool without understanding how it was made. You can inherit a technique without understanding the principles behind it. You can inherit a result without inheriting the process. And if you do not understand the process, you cannot teach it. You can only use it until it breaks. Let me give you a modern example. The Saturn V rocket, which sent humans to the moon, cannot be rebuilt. Not because the technology is too advanced, because the knowledge of how to build it no longer exists in practical form. The engineers who designed it are dead. The machinists who fabricated its parts have retired. The supply chains that produced its materials have been dismantled. The tolerances in workarounds and unwritten expertise that made it functional weren't ever fully documented. You can read the blueprints. You can study the specifications. But blueprints are not enough. They do not capture the tactile knowledge of how metal behaves under stress, or which welds require extra attention, or how to calibrate an instrument by feel. That knowledge lived in human hands and human memory. And when those hands stopped working and those memories faded, the knowledge dissolved. We still have the rockets in museums. We can measure them, photograph them, analyze their materials, but we cannot build them. We have inherited the consequence, but not the capability. Now stretch this problem across centuries. Imagine a society that refines a technique over multiple generations. Astronomy, metallurgy, selective breeding of crops, hydraulic engineering. They build something sophisticated. Something that requires deep knowledge and precise execution. Then something happens. War, famine, plague, climate shift. The population crashes. The institutions collapse. The specialists die without apprentices. The survivors inherit a landscape shaped by their ancestors. Orchards still producing fruit. Wells still drawing water. Stone structures still standing. But they do not inherit the knowledge of how these things were made. They use what they can. They maintain what they understand. The rest, they reinterpret or abandon. And over time, the techniques become rituals. The reasons become myths. The precision becomes approximation, until finally, someone tries to rebuild, and they cannot. The knowledge is gone. They have to start over, not from zero, from the rubble, which is worse, because the rubble gives the illusion of understanding. This is the pattern we see repeating throughout the archaeological record. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE. An interconnected network of civilizations spanning the eastern Mediterranean, all collapsing within a span of 50 years. Literacy disappeared in Greece for centuries. The Dark Ages between Mycenaean and Classical periods. Writing was forgotten, then reinvented, using a completely different alphabet. The Library of Alexandria burned. How many texts were lost? How many techniques? How many observations? How many records of what came before? We do not know, because we do not have them. We only have references, citations in later works, fragments copied by medieval scribes, hints that there was something else, something more complete, that we can no longer read. Roman concrete is stronger than modern concrete. It gets harder over time, especially in seawater. We know this because we have Roman harbors that are still intact after 2,000 years, while modern concrete structures begin to crack and crumble within decades. We know the Romans used volcanic ash. We know they mixed it with lime and seawater. We have analyzed the chemical composition of the concrete itself, but the exact process, the proportions, the curing time, the technique of mixing and pouring, that was lost when the Western Roman Empire collapsed. For over 1,000 years, no one in Europe could build structures as large or as durable as the Romans had. The knowledge existed in the ruins, but the knowledge of how to replicate it did not. We have only recently, in the last few decades, begun to reverse minus engineer the chemistry to understand what made it work. But we are reverse minus engineering. We are inferring from the consequence, because the process was not written down in a form that survived. So here is the question that should trouble us. If this can happen over 1,000 or 2,000 years, with written records, with institutional continuity, with unbroken chains of transmission in some regions, what happens over 10,000 years? What happens when there are no written records? When the institutions collapse completely? When the climate itself shifts and entire populations have to migrate or die? What gets lost? Not the minor details. Everything, except the consequences, the altered landscape, the domesticated species, the enriched soil, the stone structures too large to dismantle. These persist. These can be inherited. But without the context, they are simply the world as it is. They become nature. They become the starting point for the next iteration. Let us return to agriculture, the domestication of wheat, barley, rice, maize, potatoes. These are not simple processes. Wild wheat has brittle stalks. The seeds shatter and scatter when ripe. This is an evolutionary advantage for the plant. It spreads its seeds widely, but it is a disaster for a harvester. Domesticated wheat has tough stalks. The seeds stay attached until threshed. This is an evolutionary disadvantage for the plant. It cannot reproduce without human intervention. How long does it take to breed this trait? How many generations of selection, of saving seeds from the plants that happen to have slightly tougher stalks, of replanting only those seeds, of repeating the process year after year? Centuries, possibly millennia. And this had to be done independently for multiple crops in multiple regions. Wheat in the Fertile Crescent, rice in China, maize in Mesoamerica, potatoes in the Andes. The conventional narrative is that this happened naturally, as a gradual discovery by trial and error. People noticed that certain plants grew where seeds had been dropped, began to cultivate them deliberately, slowly improve them over time. But this narrative assumes an unbroken chain of practice. Continuous cultivation, continuous selection, continuous transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. What if the chain was broken? What if the cultivation stopped, then resumed later? You would still have the plants. The genetics do not reverse instantly. A field of domesticated wheat, even if abandoned, will reseed itself for a while. The traits persist. Someone returning to that field a generation later would find wheat that is already partially domesticated. They would not have to start from scratch. They would be inheriting someone else's work, but they would not know it. They would think the plant had always been this way. This is how inheritance without memory works. You receive a consequence, a modified environment, a plant that behaves unusually, an animal that is less fearful than it should be. You adapt your behavior to take advantage of it. You replant the seeds. You feed the animal. You build on the foundation that already exists, but you do not know it is a foundation. You think it is the ground, and when someone asks how this began, you do not have an answer. Because for you, it did not begin. It was already here. The same logic applies to architecture. The Egyptian pyramids appear suddenly in the historical record. The Step Pyramid of Djoser, built around 2650 BCE, is the first large scale stone structure in Egypt, but it is not primitive. It uses precisely cut limestone blocks, corbelled chambers, complex internal passages. There are no obvious precursors, no earlier pyramids that are simpler or smaller, no evidence of trial and error, just the sudden appearance of monumental stone architecture. The standard explanation is that the Egyptians developed these techniques rapidly, within a few generations, that they learned by doing, refining their methods with each project. But rapid development still requires a starting point. You do not go from mud brick to multi-ton limestone blocks without intermediate steps, unless those steps were made with materials that did not survive. With scaffolding, mud brick prototypes, experimental structures that eroded away in the millennia before anyone thought to excavate them, or unless the techniques were inherited, learned from someone else, somewhere else, in a context that left no record. I am not proposing a lost civilization. I am not suggesting ancient aliens or Atlantis or any of the other mythologies that fill this space. I am suggesting something more modest and more troubling. I am suggesting that knowledge is fragile, that transmission is unreliable, that collapse is common, and that when we look at the archaeological record and see sudden appearances of complexity, we are not necessarily seeing innovation. We are seeing reinvention. We are seeing people picking up tools they do not fully understand, in a landscape they did not create, building on foundations they did not lay. We are seeing inheritance. And the question we must ask next is this: if collapse and reinvention have happened before, and the evidence has been partially erased, how do we detect it? What are we looking for? What are the signatures of a broken chain? There is a moment in the geological record that should not exist. Approximately 12,800 years ago, the Earth was warming. The last ice age was ending. Glaciers were retreating. Sea levels were rising. Megafauna, giant mammals that had survived multiple glacial cycles, were thriving across the continents. Then, within the span of a human lifetime, the temperature dropped, not gradually, not over centuries. Within decades, possibly within years, the climate reversed. The warming stopped. The glaciers advanced again. In Greenland, ice core data shows the temperature fell by 15 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. 15 degrees. In 10 years. This is not weather variation. This is a reorganization of atmospheric circulation, a shift in ocean currents, a reconfiguration of the entire climate system. We call this the Younger Dryas event, named after a tundra flower that appears in the pollen record during this period. It lasted for approximately 1,200 years. Then, just as abruptly, it ended. The warming resumed. Within 50 years, temperatures returned to their previous levels. The megafauna did not recover. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats. Most of the large herbivores and the predators that depended on them went extinct, and at the same time, across the northern hemisphere, we see a sudden change in human archaeological sites. The Clovis culture in North America, recognizable by its distinctive fluted stone points, disappears from the record. Not gradually. Abruptly, the sites end. The tool technology changes. In the Middle East, there is a gap in settlement patterns. Sites that had been continuously occupied are abandoned. When people return, they return with different technologies, different subsistence strategies. Something happened. The exact cause is still debated. There are multiple competing theories. An impact event, possibly a fragmented comet, a massive volcanic eruption, a reorganization of ocean currents triggered by glacial meltwater. Solar variability. The mechanism matters less than the consequence. Within a single generation, the world changed. The climate shifted. The food sources collapsed. The migration routes were disrupted. And anything that required institutional continuity, specialized knowledge, or large populations to maintain, would have failed, not because people forgot, because there was no one left to remember. This is the mechanism of forgetting that we must understand. Knowledge is not lost because it is deliberately destroyed. It is lost because the chain of transmission breaks. A master craftsman dies in a famine without having trained an apprentice. A library burns during a war and the only copies of certain texts are lost. A population is displaced by climate change in the geographic knowledge, the location of resources, the seasonal patterns they had learned over generations, becomes irrelevant in their new location. Forgetting is not a failure of memory. It is a failure of continuity. And continuity requires stability, stable climate, stable food supply, stable population levels, stable institutions. When any of these collapse, knowledge begins to fragment, not all at once. The most basic skills survive. How to make fire, how to nap stone, how to find water. But the specialized knowledge, the techniques that require years of training and specific materials and uninterrupted practice, these are lost first. Metallurgy, astronomical observation, complex architecture, writing, these are luxuries. They require surplus. They require a society that can afford to have people who do not directly produce food. When the surplus disappears, so do the specialists. Let me give you a specific example of how this works. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. It is harder than pure copper, easier to cast, more durable. But copper and tin do not occur together naturally. Copper deposits are common in many regions. Tin deposits are rare and geographically concentrated. To make bronze, you need a trade network. You need miners extracting tin in one location, copper in another, and traders moving these materials hundreds or thousands of kilometers to workshops where they can be combined. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Mediterranean had this network. Tin from Afghanistan or Cornwall, copper from Cyprus. Trade routes across multiple kingdoms, maintained by treaties and mutual interest. When the Bronze Age collapsed around 1200 BCE, this network shattered, not because people forgot how to make bronze, because they could no longer access tin. The trade routes were disrupted. The kingdoms that maintained them fell. The mines were abandoned or controlled by groups that did not participate in the old trade systems. For centuries, bronze became scarce. Smiths recycled old tools, old weapons. They hoarded what they had. The knowledge of how to make bronze did not disappear, but the ability to make it did, and in the absence of bronze, people adapted. They used iron, which was more difficult to work but more widely available. They reverted to stone tools in some regions. They simplified their technology to match the available resources. This is not forgetting. This is triage. You preserve what you can with what you have. And what you cannot preserve, you let go. Now imagine this process happening not over a few centuries, but over thousands of years. Not with one collapse, but with multiple cycles, warming and cooling, expansion and contraction, complexity and simplification. Each cycle, some knowledge is lost. Each cycle, some techniques are reinvented, but not exactly as they were before. Each cycle, the starting point is different. Because the landscape has changed, the climate has changed, the available resources have changed. You do not get a linear progression. You get a pattern of rise and fall, innovation and loss, with each iteration building on fragments of what came before. This is not a narrative of advancement. It is a narrative of adaptation, and adaptation does not leave a clear record. It leaves a confusing one. The Younger Dry, as is not the only climate catastrophe in the archaeological record. It is simply one of the most dramatic. Between 3200 and 2900 BCE, a severe drought struck the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Settlements were abandoned. Population levels dropped. The old kingdom of Egypt, which had been stable for centuries, faced internal collapse. The drought lasted for approximately 300 years. When it ended, the survivors rebuilt. But they rebuilt differently. Between 1200 and 1150 BCE, the Bronze Age collapse. We have already mentioned this. A cascade of failures across multiple civilizations. Literacy disappeared in some regions. It took centuries to recover. Between 535 and 536 CE, a volcanic eruption Possibly Ilopango in El Salvador, ejected enough ash into the atmosphere to dim the sun globally. Temperatures dropped, crops failed, the Byzantine Empire faced famine. The plague of Justinian followed shortly after, killing millions. Each of these events disrupted continuity. Each of them forced societies to adapt, to simplify, to prioritize survival over preservation. And each of them erased portions of the record. This is the pattern we must recognize. Collapse is not abnormal. Collapse is the default state. Stability is the anomaly. The periods of continuous institutional memory, continuous technological development, continuous population growth. These are brief windows between catastrophes, and during those windows, we build. We accumulate knowledge. We refine techniques, but we build on sand. We build in the intervals between disruptions. And when the disruption comes, as it always does, we discover that much of what we thought was permanent was contingent. Contingent on climate. Contingent on trade. Contingent on a specific set of resources being available in a specific configuration. When the configuration changes, the knowledge that depended on it becomes useless. You can know how to build a ship, but if the forests are gone, you cannot build ships. You can know how to smelt iron, but if the fuel is too expensive, you cannot smelt iron. You can know how to write, but if there is no one to read, writing becomes decoration. So what survives a collapse? Not the complex knowledge, not the specialized techniques. What survives is practice, the things you do every day. The things that do not require explanation because everyone knows them. The things that are transmitted not through teaching but through imitation. How to plant seeds. How to tend animals. How to find edible plants. How to make basic tools. These survive because they do not require institutions. They do not require specialists. They do not require written records. They survive because they are essential. But the higher minus order knowledge, the mathematics, the astronomy, the engineering, philosophy, this requires leisure. It requires a society wealthy enough to support people who think rather than labor. And when the wealth disappears, so does the thinking, not immediately. There is a lag. The last generation of scholars, trying to preserve what they can, copying texts, training students. But if the catastrophe is severe enough, there are no students, or the students are too busy surviving to study, or the texts are burned for fuel, and within a generation, the knowledge exists only in memory. And memory, unlike stone, does not fossilize. This brings us to the concept of the palimpsest. A palimpsest is a manuscript that has been erased and written over. Parchment was expensive in the medieval period. Scribes would scrape off old text and reuse the parchment for new writing. But the old text does not disappear completely. Faint traces remain. Under the right light, with the right techniques, you can sometimes read what was written before. The earth is a palimpsest. Every human society that has existed has written on the landscape. They have cleared forests, diverted rivers, enriched soil, built structures, modified ecosystems, and then they have been written over. New societies, new modifications, new layers. But the old layers do not disappear completely. Traces remain. The problem is that we do not always recognize them as traces. We see them as natural features, as the baseline, as the way things have always been. We do not see the text beneath the text. Let me give you an example. The Amazon basin, which I mentioned earlier, was thought to be untouched wilderness until very recently. The narrative was that the jungle was too hostile for large scale human habitation. The soil was too poor. The diseases were too severe, but this narrative was based on the Amazon as it existed after European contact. After 90% of the indigenous population died from introduced diseases. After the trade networks collapsed. After the management systems failed. What the Europeans saw was not the Amazon as it had been. It was the Amazon in the process of rewilding. A managed landscape, abandoned, reverting to jungle. The terra preta, the enriched soil, was not recognized as artificial until the 20th century. The geometric earthworks were not detected until LIDA made them visible through the canopy. The extent of pre-contact population was not understood until recently. We inherited a landscape that had already been rewritten. And because we did not recognize it as a rewrite, we assumed it was the original. This is the danger of the palimpsest. If you do not know there is text beneath the text, you do not think to look for it. Now apply this logic to the rest of the planet. How many forests are not natural, but are the remnants of orchards that were abandoned? How many grasslands were created by deliberate burning, by managed grazing, by the extermination of competing species? How many coastlines were occupied by settlements that are now underwater, drowned by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age? The sea level has risen approximately 120 meters since the last glacial maximum, approximately 400 feet. Every coastline on Earth has moved inland by kilometers, sometimes tens of kilometers. And coastlines are where people live. Coastlines provide access to marine resources, to trade routes, to river mouths where fish congregate. If there were settlements on the old coastlines, they are now underwater, under sediment, under centuries of marine deposition. We are not looking for them because we cannot easily look for them. Underwater archaeology is expensive, time-maintenance consuming, and limited in scope, so we assume the coastlines were empty. We assume people only began to settle near the sea after the sea level stabilized. But this is an assumption based on absence of evidence, not on evidence of absence. Here is what we know. We know that climate has been unstable. We know that human societies have collapsed multiple times. We know that knowledge is fragile and transmission is unreliable. We know that the landscape has been modified extensively. We know that much of what we think of as natural is actually the consequence of prior human activity. We know that the archaeological record is incomplete, biased toward what preserves, biased toward stone and pottery, biased toward dry climates and sheltered locations. And we know that we are standing in the middle of the sequence, not at the beginning. So when we see anomalies, when we see complexity appearing without precedent, when we see knowledge that seems to arrive too early, we should not assume we are seeing the origin. We should assume we are seeing the inheritance. An inheritance that has been partially erased, partially rewritten, partially misunderstood. An inheritance that we are now building on, just as those before us built on what they inherited. We are not the first. We are not the discoverers. We are the latest iteration. And the question we must ask is not what did our ancestors achieve, but what did they inherit that we can no longer see? There is a practical problem we must address. Even if we accept that knowledge can be lost, that societies can collapse, that the landscape has been rewritten multiple times, we still face a fundamental constraint. We can only find what leaves a trace, and most things do not leave traces. This is not a philosophical statement. It is a chemical one. Organic material decomposes. The rate of decomposition depends on temperature, moisture, oxygen availability, pH of the soil, and the presence of microorganisms. In a tropical rainforest, a wooden structure can be reduced to soil within decades. The termites consume it. The fungi break it down. The bacteria metabolize it. The rain leaches away the residue. Within a century, there's nothing left but a slight discoloration in the soil, a minor change in nutrient composition that would be invisible without chemical analysis. In a desert, the same structure can last for millennia. The dry air desiccates it. The lack of moisture prevents microbial growth. The wood becomes hard, brittle, but structurally intact. This creates a preservation bias. We find more archaeological sites in deserts than in rainforests. Not because more people lived in deserts, but because deserts preserve evidence. The rainforests were likely more densely populated. They provided more resources, more biodiversity, more stable food supplies. But they also erase their own history. Consider the materials available to a pre-industrial society: stone, wood, fiber, bone, shell, leather, clay. Of these, only stone and fired clay are durable on archaeological temescals. Wood rots. Fiber disintegrates. Bone can fossilize under specific conditions, but usually it decays. Leather returns to the soil. Unfired clay dissolves in rain. So if a society built primarily with wooden fiber, used rope and leather for bindings, stored food in woven baskets, and wore plant-fiber clothing, they would leave almost no archaeological trace. We would find their stone tools, if they made any. We would find their fire pits if we excavated in the right locations. We would find their middens, the trash heaps of shells and bones, if they lived near the coast and the middens were not eroded. But we would not find their houses, their boats, their clothing, their tools made of perishable materials, their art, if it was painted on bark or woven into textiles. We would not find 90% of their material culture, and from that remaining 10%, we would have to reconstruct their entire society. This is not speculation. This is the reality of archaeology. We have excellent preservation in places like Egypt, where the dry climate and the practice of mummification have left us intact textiles, wood on furniture, leather sandals, even food. We have excellent preservation in permafrosts, where organic material is frozen and bacterial activity is halted. The Iceman Tootsie, discovered in the Alps, had intact clothing, a copper axe, a bow, arrows with feather fletching. We have excellent preservation in peat bogs, where the acidic, oxygen-poor environment prevents decomposition. Bog bodies from Iron Age Europe still have skin, hair, even the contents of their last meals preserved in their stomachs. But these are exceptions. These are accidents of chemistry and geography. For every site with exceptional preservation, there are thousands of sites where only the stone remains. And from those sites, we extrapolate. We assume that what we can see is representative of what existed. But it is not representative. It is a filtered sample, biased toward the durable. Let me make this concrete. Suppose there were two societies existing at the same time in the same region. Society A builds with stone. They quarry granite, carve it into blocks, construct monumental architecture. They make pottery, fire it in kilns, use it for storage and cooking. They bury their dead in stone-lined tombs with grave goods made of durable materials. Society B builds with bamboo. They lash together frames with plant fiber rope, thatch their roofs with palm leaves. They use gourds and woven baskets for storage. They cook in containers made of bark or leaves, replaced frequently. They cremate their dead and scatter the ashes in rivers. 10,000 years pass. What remains of Society A? Stone structures, eroded but recognizable. Pottery shards scattered across the landscape. Tombs that can be excavated, with skeletons and artifacts intact. What remains of Society B? Almost nothing. Possibly some discoloration in the soil where posts were planted. Possibly some charcoal from fire pits. Possibly some stone tools, if they used any. An archaeologist, excavating this region, would conclude that Society A was advanced, organized, capable of monumental construction. They would conclude that Society B, if they detected them at all, was simple, scattered, less developed. But this conclusion would be based entirely on preservation bias. Society B might have been equally complex. They might have had sophisticated social organization, long-distance trade networks, detailed astronomical knowledge, complex oral traditions, but none of that fossilizes. You would never know. This is the epistemological problem at the heart of archaeology. We cannot detect what does not preserve, and what does not preserve is most of human activity. The structures we can see, the pyramids and temples and fortifications, these are not typical. These are extraordinary. The typical dwelling, the typical tool, the typical garment, these are gone. We are studying the outliers and calling them the norm. Now consider the temescals involved. Anatomically modern humans have existed for approximately 300. Behaviorally modern humans, with language and symbolic thought, for at least 70 years. For most of that time, we have essentially no archaeological record. Not because nothing happened, but because nothing preserved. We have occasional stone tools. We have occasional campsites. We have cave paintings in locations where the caves provided shelter from the elements. But the vast majority of sites, the places where people lived and worked and died, have been eroded, buried, or chemically dissolved. The older the site, the less likely it is to survive. This is not just because of cumulative erosion. It is because older sites have been subjected to more geological events. Sea level changes, glaciation, tectonic activity, volcanic eruptions, sediment deposition, river course changes. Any one of these can bury a site, or destroy it, or move it kilometers from its original location. A site from 50,000 years ago has been through multiple glacial cycles. It has been subjected to freeze-thaw weathering, to changes in vegetation that alter soil chemistry, to shifts in drainage patterns that cause erosion. The probability that such a site survives, in a form we can detect, is vanishingly small. This is why the early human archaeological record is so sparse. Not because early humans were rare or inactive, but because their traces have been erased by time. We find more sites from the last 10,000 years than from the previous 290,000 combined. Not because humanity suddenly became more numerous or more active. 0 years is short enough that some sites survive. And yet, even within that 10,000-year window, we are missing most of the evidence. We have found approximately 5,000 Neolithic settlements worldwide. This sounds like a large number, but the Neolithic lasted for approximately 7,000 years. If each settlement was occupied for an average of 200 years, which is a conservative estimate, that means there should have been approximately 35,000 settlements existing at any given time. Over 7,000 years. That's 1.2 million settlement phases. We have found 5,000. We are seeing less than 1% of what existed. The implication is uncomfortable. Everything we know about the Neolithic, about the Bronze Age, about the rise of agriculture and the development of cities, is based on a tiny, non-representative sample. We are making inferences from fragments. We are building narratives from exceptions. And we are doing this while fully aware that most of the evidence is gone. So when we say that agriculture began in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BCE, what we actually mean is that the earliest evidence we have found for agriculture is in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BCE. But absence of earlier evidence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of poor preservation or insufficient search. Agriculture could have been practiced earlier, in locations that did not preserve, using methods that left no trace. We would not know. Let me give you a thought experiment. Suppose a society existed 30,000 years ago. They lived along a coastline that is now 100 meters underwater. They built with wooden plant fiber. They had boats made of bark or sewn hides, which they used for fishing and trade along the coast. They had no agriculture, but they managed wild plant resources. They selectively harvested, they pruned, they transplanted useful species closer to their settlements. They burned underbrush to encourage new growth and attract game. They had complex social structures, clan systems, trade partnerships, seasonal gathering sites. They had oral traditions that encoded astronomical observations, genealogies, territorial boundaries. They had art. They carved wood, they wove textiles, they made jewelry from shells and seeds. They painted their bodies with plant dyes. Then the Ice Age ended. Sea levels rose. Their coastline was inundated. The settlements were drowned, buried under marine sediment. The survivors moved inland to regions already occupied by other groups. They merged, they adapted, they lost some of their coastal knowledge because it was no longer relevant. Within a few generations, the old coastline was forgotten. The settlements were gone. The boats had rotted. The wooden carvings had dissolved. The textiles had disintegrated. What evidence would remain? Some stone tools, if any had been dropped in locations that later became land. Some shell middens, if they had been above the high-tide line and avoided erosion. Possibly some rock art, if they had painted in caves that survived. That is all. From this evidence, could we reconstruct their society? Could we detect their boats, their management of plant resources, their trade networks, their social complexity? No. We would see scattered stone tools and assume they were simple hunter-gatherers, living in small mobile bands, leaving no permanent mark. We would be completely wrong, but we would have no way to know we were wrong, because the evidence that would prove us wrong is underwater, buried, and dissolved. This is not a hypothetical. This is the situation we are actually in. Sea levels have risen 120 meters since the last glacial maximum. Every coast on Earth has moved inland, and coastlines are where people live. They always have been. Marine resources are abundant and predictable. Coasts provide access to multiple ecosystems: ocean, estuary, river, terrestrial. They are natural trade routes. If we assume that coastal population density 15,000 years ago was even remotely comparable to historical coastal population density, then the majority of the human population at that time was living in areas that are now underwater. We have not excavated those areas. We have barely begun to survey them. The few underwater sites that have been found are tantalizing. Submerged settlements off the coast of India, off Japan, in the Mediterranean. Stone structures, pottery tools, but underwater archaeology is expensive and technically difficult. We have surveyed less than 1% of the submerged coastlines. 90-9% of the potential sites remain unexamined. So here is what we must accept. The archaeological record is not a comprehensive history. It is a small, biased sample of human activity, filtered through the physics of preservation and the accidents of discovery. What we can see is not representative of what existed. It is representative of what survived. And survival is not random. It is systematic. Stone survives. Pottery survives. Dry climates preserve. Wet climates erase. This means that our understanding of the past is systematically biased towards stone minus using, pottery minus making societies in arid regions. Everything else is invisible, not because it did not exist, because it left no trace we can detect. This brings us to a critical realization. When we look for evidence of past complexity, we are looking for stone, monumental architecture, megaliths, carved reliefs, stone tools with standardized forms. If a society was complex but did not use stone, we cannot see them. If they built cities of wood, if they stored knowledge in oral traditions, if they navigated by the stars without building observatories, if they practiced sophisticated agriculture without terracing or irrigation works, they are invisible to us. They could have existed. They could have been numerous. They could have been highly organized, and we would never know. The absence of stone architecture is not evidence of simplicity. It is evidence of different material choices, but we interpret it as simplicity because that is all we can see. There is one more layer to this problem. Even when evidence exists, we must be able to recognize it. We must know what we are looking for. We must have a framework that allows us to interpret what we find. And if what we find does not fit our framework, we often miss it entirely. The terra preta in the Amazon was known for over a century before anyone realized it was artificial. It was not until chemical analysis showed the high concentrations of charcoal in pottery fragments that archaeologists understood it was human minus made. The Nazca lines in Peru were visible from surrounding hills, but their scale and organization were not understood until aerial photography made the patterns clear. From the ground, they look like cleared paths. From the air, they are massive geometric figures and animal shapes. The LIDA, our surveys of the Maya lowlands, revealed thousands of structures that had been invisible under the jungle canopy. Archaeologists had walked past them for decades, seeing only forested hills. In each case, the evidence was there, but it was not detected because we did not have the tools or the perspective to see it. How much more evidence exists that we still cannot see? How many sites are we walking past, dismissing as natural features, because we do not yet have the technology or the conceptual framework to recognize them? This is the humility that data demands. We know very little. What we know is provisional, based on incomplete information, filtered through preservation bias and detection limits. Every decade, new technologies reveal new sites. Ground minus penetrating radar, LIDAR, satellite imagery, isotope analysis, ancient DNA. Each of these expands what we can detect. Each of them reveals complexity we had missed, and each of them suggests that there is far more complexity we are still missing. The archaeological record is not complete. It is not even close to complete. It is a rough draft, written in disappearing ink, with most of the pages missing, and we are trying to reconstruct the narrative from the fragments that happen to have survived. So when we ask whether past societies could have been more complex than we think, the answer is not speculative. The answer is probably. Probably there were societies that left no stone. Probably there were techniques that used perishable materials. Probably there were settlements on coastlines now underwater. Probably there were knowledge systems encoded in forms that did not fossilize. We cannot prove this because proof requires evidence, and the evidence is gone. But the absence of evidence is not surprising. It is expected. It is the default outcome of time acting on organic materials in most environments. What would be surprising is if the evidence had survived. What would be anomalous is if we could see everything. We cannot. We see the stone, we see the pottery, we see the exceptions. And from these exceptions, we extrapolate. But we must remember that we are extrapolating. We are inferring. We are building models from incomplete data. And models built from incomplete data are always provisional. They are the best we can do with what we have, but they are not the truth. They are approximations. And the difference between an approximation and the truth is precisely what we cannot see. This is the boundary we must acknowledge. There is a limit to what archaeology can tell us. Not because archaeologists are not skilled or dedicated, but because the data itself is incomplete. Time has erased most of the evidence. Preservation has filtered what remains. Detection limits determine what we can find. Beyond this boundary, there is only inference, only models, only probabilities. We can say what is likely. We can say what is consistent with the evidence. We can say what would be required for certain scenarios to be true, but we cannot say what actually happened, because we do not have access to what actually happened. We have access only to the traces. And traces are not the event. They are the aftermath. So as we proceed, as we try to understand what we have inherited, we must carry this uncertainty with us. We are working with fragments. We are looking through a distorted lens. We are seeing the landscape after it has been rewritten multiple times, and we are trying to read the text beneath the text. Some of it we can recover. Some of it we can infer, but much of it is simply gone, and we must make our peace with that. The past is not fully knowable. It is partially knowable, and the part we can know is not necessarily the most important part. It is simply the part that survived. We inherit a planet, not a history. This is the distinction we must hold clearly. History is a narrative. It is a sequence of events, explained in contextuality, with causes and effects linked in chains of reasoning. But what we actually receive is not a narrative. It is a physical state, a configuration of matter, a distribution of species, a composition of soil, a topology of land. This physical state is the consequence of everything that came before. But the consequence does not explain itself. A forest does not tell you who planted it. Enriched soil does not reveal the techniques used to create it. A domesticated species does not carry the story of its domestication. The consequence persists. The process is silent. Let me anchor this with an example you can verify. The forests of New England, which appear ancient and wild, are mostly less than 150 years old. In the mid-1800 seconds, approximately 80% of New England was deforested, cleared for agriculture, for pasture, for timber. The landscape was open farmland, stone walls dividing fields, sheep grazing on hillsides. Then the Industrial Revolution arrived. People moved to cities. The farms were abandoned. The forest returned, but it did not return to its original state. The species composition changed. The stone walls remained, now running through the middle of forests. The soil chemistry was different, altered by decades of agricultural practice. If you walk through a New England forest today, you see what appears to be wilderness. You see large trees, dense understory, the aesthetic of untouched nature. But if you know what to look for, you see the walls. You see the non-native species. You see the evidence of prior clearing. The forest is not primordial. It is secondary growth. It is a consequence masquerading as an origin. And if you did not know the history, if there weren't written records, you would assume the forest had always been there. You would inherit the consequence without knowing the process. Now scale this logic. The entire planet is secondary growth. Every ecosystem has been modified by human activity. Some obviously, some subtly, some recently, some so long ago that the modification has become invisible. We have already discussed the Amazon, the terra preta, the managed orchards, the geometric earthworks. What appears to be wilderness is actually an abandoned garden. But this pattern is global. The grasslands of the Great Plains were maintained by intentional burning, practiced by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The fires prevented tree growth, encouraged grass, attracted bison. When the burning stopped after European colonization, the tree line began to advance. The grasslands began to shrink. The ecosystem was not stable. It was maintained. The kelp forests off the coast of California were managed by indigenous harvesting of sea urchins. The urchins, when overpopulated, overgrazed the kelp. By keeping urchin populations low, humans maintained the kelp forests. When the harvesting stopped, urchin populations exploded. The kelp forests collapsed. What had appeared to be a natural balance was actually a managed equilibrium. The Australian landscape was shaped by Aboriginal fire practices over tens of years. Controlled burns that cleared underbrush, promoted specific plant species, created a mosaic of habitats. The eucalyptus forests, the grasslands, the distribution of animal species, all of these were consequences of deliberate management. When the management stopped, the fire regime changed. Fuel loads increased. Wildfires became more severe and less predictable. The ecosystem did not revert to a pre-human state. It destabilized. This is the pattern we must recognize. Human activity does not simply add to nature. It becomes part of the system. The system adapts to the activity. And when the activity stops, the system does not return to equilibrium. It shifts to a new state. That new state is still a consequence of human activity. But it is a consequence of absence, not presence. The ecosystem shaped by fire, then abandoned, does not become what it was before fire. It becomes something else entirely. And after enough time, we forget that fire was ever part of the system. We see the new state and assume it is natural. We inherit the consequence of abandonment and call it wilderness. This applies to more than ecosystems. We inherit languages, but languages are not static. They are living systems, constantly adapting, borrowing, simplifying, complexifying. English is a Germanic language that borrowed extensively from Latin and French. Why? Because of historical conquests, political dominance, cultural exchange. But the language itself does not tell you this. You have to reconstruct it through comparative linguistics, through historical records, through analysis of cognates and loanwords. The consequence, the language as it exists now, is the result of processes that are not visible in the language itself. We inherit technologies, but technologies are often black boxes. We know how to use them, but not necessarily how they work or why they were designed that way. QWERTY keyboard layout was designed to slow typists down, to prevent mechanical typewriters from jamming. The mechanical constraint no longer exists, but the layout persists because we have inherited it, because retraining millions of typists is prohibitively expensive. The consequence, the layout remains. The reason, the jamming problem, is gone. We inherit institutions, legal systems, property rights, political boundaries. These are not natural. They are the accumulated consequences of historical conflicts, treaties, compromises. But the institutions themselves do not explain their origins. They simply exist, and we operate within them as if they were inevitable. Now apply this to the deep past. We inherit a planet that has been shaped by human activity for tens of thousands of years, possibly longer. We inherit domesticated species that cannot survive without us. Wheat that does not shatter. Maize that cannot self-propagate. Dogs that are genetically distinct from wolves. We inherit landscapes that have been cleared, burned, planted, abandoned, and recolonized. We inherit knowledge, but in fragments. Techniques that work, but whose principles we do not fully understand. Stories that have been passed down, but whose original meanings have been lost or reinterpreted. And we stand in the middle of this, looking around, trying to determine what is natural and what is artificial. But the distinction is meaningless. Everything is artificial. Everything is consequence. There is no baseline. There is no state of nature to return to. There is only the current configuration, which is the result of all prior configurations, stretching back through time in an unbroken, but mostly invisible chain. This is what it means to be an inheritor. You receive the world as it is, not as it was. You receive the consequences, not the intentions. You receive the results, not the process. And you build on those consequences. You adapt to the world you inherited. You take the species that already exist, the landscapes that are already configured, the knowledge that has already been passed down, and you work with them. You do not start from zero. You start from wherever the previous generation left off, but you do not necessarily know where they left off. You do not necessarily understand what they were trying to do, or why certain things are the way they are. You simply inherit and proceed. This creates a problem of interpretation. When we look at the past, we try to understand it as a series of decisions, of innovations, of deliberate actions. We ask, why did they build this? What were they trying to achieve? What knowledge did they have? But these questions assume that the past was making active choices from a neutral starting point. In reality, the past was also inheriting. They were also standing on consequences. They were also working with materials and knowledge and landscapes that had been shaped by those who came before them. They were not starting from nature. They were starting from the middle. And when they innovated, they were often just rediscovering or recombining or adapting things that had existed before in forms that had been partially forgotten. This is why we see sudden appearances of complexity, not because complexity arose from simplicity in a single leap, but because complexity was being reconstructed from fragments of prior complexity. The fragments were the inheritance. The reconstruction was the innovation. But from our perspective, millennia later, we see only the reconstruction. We do not see the fragments it was built from, because the fragments were perishable or have been eroded away. Let me give you a concrete example of this pattern. Agriculture, as we discussed, appears in multiple locations around the world within a relatively narrow time window. Approximately 10,000 to 8,000 BCE. The standard explanation is that this was a response to climate change. The end of the Ice Age created more stable conditions, which allowed for the development of farming. But this explanation has always been incomplete. Climate stability is necessary but not sufficient. You still need knowledge. You still need the recognition that seeds can be planted, that certain plants can be encouraged, that yields can be improved through selection. This knowledge does not arise spontaneously. It accumulates through trial and error, over generations. So where did it come from? One possibility: it was not new knowledge. It was inherited knowledge. Humans had been interacting with plants for thousands of years before agriculture. Gathering, processing, transporting seeds. Noticing which plants grew near camps. Noticing which plants produced more seeds, larger seeds, seeds that were easier to process. This knowledge was being accumulated during the entire late Pleistocene. Not as formal agriculture, but as management, as cultivation without domestication. Then the Younger Dryas event disrupted everything. Populations crashed. Management systems collapsed. The knowledge fragmented. When the climate stabilized again, the survivors were working with plants that had already been partially modified. The selection had already begun. The plants were pre-adapted to cultivation, and the knowledge, though fragmented, was still present in oral traditions. Stories about which plants to favor, practices inherited from previous generations. The survivors were not inventing agriculture. They were reconstructing it from the ruins of prior cultivation systems. This is speculation, because we do not have evidence. The evidence is gone, erased by time and by the perishable nature of plant materials. But it is consistent with what we do see: the suddenness of domestication, the multiple independent origins. The fact that agriculture appears with plants that are already partially domesticated. These patterns make more sense if agriculture is a reconstruction, not an invention. The same logic applies to megalithic architecture. Göbekli Tepe, which we have discussed, appears suddenly in the archaeological record. No obvious precursors. No simple versions that gradually become more complex. Just massive stone pillars, carved with sophisticated reliefs, arranged in patterns that suggest astronomical knowledge. If we assume this was invented from scratch, it is baffling. Why would hunter-gatherers suddenly decide to quarry and move 16 stones? But if we assume they were inheriting, the pattern makes more sense. They were living in a landscape that had been modified before. They had stories about structures, about alignments, about the importance of marking certain locations. They were rebuilding, using what they could, with the resources available, attempting to recreate something that had existed before. The scale suggests ambition. The sophistications suggest knowledge. But the knowledge might not have been new. It might have been remembered imperfectly, remembered in fragments, but remembered. This is the model I am proposing. Human history is not a linear progression from simplicity to complexity. It is a cycle of complexity, collapse, and reconstruction. Each cycle builds on the ruins of the previous cycle. Each cycle inherits consequences without fully understanding their origins. Knowledge is preserved in practice, in landscape modification, in partially domesticated species, in oral traditions that have lost their original context but retain their procedures. And each cycle, attempting to make sense of what they have inherited, builds something new, something that looks like innovation, but is actually recombination. This is why we see anomalies. This is why technologies appear out of sequence. This is why complexity seems to arrive suddenly, not because it was invented suddenly, because it was being reconstructed from inherited fragments. And the reconstruction process is faster than the original development process. When you are rebuilding, you do not need to rediscover the principles. You only need to remember the form. And form, unlike principle, can be transmitted through imitation. So what does this mean for us? It means we are not the first. We are not the discoverers. We are not the originators. We are inheritors, standing on a planet that has been shaped by countless prior generations, most of whose names we will never know. We are building on consequences we did not create, working with materials we did not develop, using knowledge we did not originate. And someday, if we collapse, if our institutions fail, if our knowledge fragments, the next inheritors will stand where we stood. They will look at our ruins and try to understand what we were doing. They will find the consequences, the altered landscapes, the modified species, the structures made of durable materials, and they will not understand. They will inherit, and they will rebuild, and they will think they are inventing, but they will be reconstructing. Just as we are reconstructing, just as those before us reconstructed. This is the cycle. This is the pattern. Complexity, collapse, inheritance, reconstruction, over and over in layers, each one partially erasing the one before. The earth is a palimpsest. We have said this before. But now we understand what it means. It means the text has been written, erased, and rewritten so many times that the original is no longer recoverable. It means we are reading a document that has been edited by time, by chemistry, by erosion, by the accumulated weight of sediment. It means what we see is not the original. It is not even a faithful copy. It is a heavily redacted version, with most of the content missing and much of the remainder illegible. And yet, we try to read it. We try to reconstruct the narrative, not because we will succeed completely, but because the attempt itself is meaningful, because we are part of the cycle, we are part of the text, and what we write now will also be partially erased, partially rewritten, partially inherited by those who come after. This is the inheritance we must accept. We are temporary. Our knowledge is fragile. Our constructions will erode, but the consequences will persist. The species we modify will continue to exist, in some form. The landscapes we alter will continue to shape the behavior of those who inhabit them. The knowledge we encode, in whatever form survives, will be inherited and reinterpreted. We will become the layer beneath, the faint trace under the new text. The anomaly that future archaeologists puzzle over, and they will stand where we stand now, looking back, trying to understand. They will ask the same questions. What did they know? What were they trying to do? Why did they build this? And they will not have complete answers, because the answers will have eroded away, but the consequences will remain, and from those consequences, they will build, just as we build from the consequences we inherited. This is not a narrative of loss. It is a narrative of continuity. We are not separate from the past. We are continuous with it. We are made of it. Every atom in our bodies has been recycled through previous organisms. Every plant we eat is the descendant of plants that were domesticated by people whose names we do not know. Every tool we use is a refinement of tools that were invented, forgotten, and reinvented multiple times. We are standing on consequences, all the way down. There is no bottom. There is no origin point we can identify. There is only the continuous process of inheritance and transformation, and this process will continue after us. The planet will be inherited again. The consequences will accumulate, the text will be rewritten, and somewhere, deep in the layers, our chapter will remain, partially legible, partially erased, a faint trace under the new text, a consequence waiting to be inherited. So here is the final question, not what did we inherit? We have explored that. We have seen the patterns, the anomalies, the breaks in the sequence. The final question is, what are we leaving? What will be the consequences of our presence? What will persist after we are gone? Not our intentions, not our narrative, not our explanations. The consequences, the altered atmosphere, the modified species, the synthetic materials that do not decompose, the radioactive isotopes, the plastic in the sediment, the concrete and steel that will erode into stains in the rock. These are what will persist. These are what will be inherited, and those who inherit will stand on these consequences, just as we stand on the consequences left by those before us. They will not understand what we were trying to do. They will only see what we did. They will inherit a planet that has been changed, and they will adapt to that change. They will build on it. They will work with it. They will take the world as they find it and assume it has always been that way, just as we do. This is the cycle we are part of. This is the inheritance we cannot escape. We are consequences, leaving consequences in an unbroken chain that extends back to the beginning of human consciousness and will extend forward to whatever comes after us. And the question is not whether we will be remembered. The question is, what will we leave behind? There is a moment, late in the life of any civilization, when its people begin to ask what will remain, not what will be remembered. Memory is fragile. Records burn. Languages shift. Names dissolve into syllables that mean nothing to those who come after. But what will remain is consequence. What will persist in the physical world? What will be inherited by those who do not know they are inheriting? We are in that moment now, not because collapse is imminent, but because we have, for the first time in human history, the capacity to see the full depth of time, to understand the geological scales, to recognize how temporary everything is, and how persistent consequences can be. We have walked through the silence before writing. We have examined the anomalies in the sequence, the structures that appear without precedent, the knowledge that seems to arrive fully full. We have discussed catastrophe and forgetting, the mechanisms by which continuity breaks, the way knowledge fragments and must be reconstructed from ruins. We have confronted the limits of detection, the preservation bias, the uncomfortable reality that most of what happened left no trace we can find. And we have stood on consequences, recognizing that we are not the beginning but the middle, that we are building on foundations we did not lay, in a landscape we did not create, with materials that have been shaped by processes we only partially understand. Now we must ask, what does this mean? Not in the abstract, not as an intellectual exercise. What does it mean to know that we are inheritors? That the past is mostly invisible? That complexity has risen and fallen before, leaving only faint traces? One answer is despair. If everything is temporary, if knowledge is so fragile, if collapse is inevitable, why build anything? Why preserve anything? White rye. But this is the wrong conclusion. The impermanence is not the point. The consequences are the point. We do not control what will be remembered, but we control what we do. We control how we modify the landscape. We control which species we preserve and which we extinguish. We control what materials we release into the environment, what isotopes we embed in the geological record, what structures we build from materials that will outlast our understanding of why we built them. These are not questions of memory. These are questions of consequence. And consequences persist. The people who enriched the Amazonian soil with terrapretid did not know that 2,000 years later, we would still be measuring the carbon content, still trying to understand their methods. They were simply improving their soil. They were trying to grow more food to support their communities, to make their lives easier. But the consequence of their work persists. The soil is still more fertile. The forest that grew on that soil is still shaped by the nutrients they added. They changed the world, not through grand monuments or written declarations, through daily practice, through small improvements repeated over generations, and those improvements became part of the baseline for everyone who came after. This is the model we should carry forward. Not what will we be remembered for, But what consequences will we leave? What will the inheritors find? What will they have to work with? What baseline will we create for them? These are physical questions, material questions. Will the soil be richer or poorer? Will the atmosphere be more stable or less? Will the species diversity be greater or diminished? Will the materials we leave behind degrade into harmless compounds or persist as toxins? Will the forests be standing or burned? Will the aquifers be full or depleted? Will the coastlines be intact or drowned? These are the inheritances we are creating right now. These are the consequences that will persist long after our languages have shifted, our records have degraded, our names have been forgotten. And here is the uncomfortable realization. We cannot control the narrative. We cannot control how we will be interpreted. Future archaeologists, if they exist, will look at our layer in the geological record and draw conclusions. They will see the plastic, the concrete, the radiantals, the altered isotope ratios in the atmosphere. They will see the mass extinction we are causing, the climate we are destabilizing, the synthetic compounds we are dispersing, and they will form a judgment. But that judgment will not be based on our intentions. It will be based on consequences. They will not care that we meant well. They will not care that we weren't trying to improve our lives, to feed our populations, to advance our technologies. They will only see what we did. This is the accountability that deep time imposes. We are accountable not to the present, but to the future. Not to our contemporaries, but to the inheritors. And the inheritors will not ask us to justify our choices. They will simply receive the consequences and adapt. If we leave them a stable climate, they will build on that stability. If we leave them a destabilized climate, they will adapt to the instability. If we leave them rich soils and diverse ecosystems, they will inherit abundance. If we leave them depleted soils and simplified ecosystems, they will inherit scarcity. We are choosing right now, through our daily practices, what they will inherit, and we cannot avoid this choice. Inaction is also a choice. Allowing processes to continue is also a decision. So let me return to the question I posed at the beginning. If we are inheritors, standing on consequences we did not create, working with knowledge we only partially understand, what should we do? 1. Answer: be cautious. Recognize that our understanding is incomplete. Recognize that unintended consequences are not anomalies but norms. Recognize that every action we take will ripple forward in time in ways we cannot fully predict. This is not an argument for paralysis. It is an argument for humility. We do not know what we are doing, not completely. We cannot see the full chain of consequences. We are building on foundations we do not fully understand, in a system whose complexity exceeds our models. So we should act carefully. We should preserve optionality. We should avoid irreversible changes when possible. We should recognize that the inheritors will need resources, will need stable systems, will need the capacity to adapt, and we should try not to foreclose those options. Another answer: preserve knowledge, but recognize that preservation is not automatic. Knowledge does not persist through wish or intention. It persists through practice, through institutions, through continuous transmission. If we want future generations to understand what we understood, we must encode it in multiple forms. Written records, yes, but also practices, oral traditions, physical structures that embody principles. We must build redundancy. We must assume that some transmission pathways will fail. We must teach not just results but processes. Not just what works but why it works. Because inheritors who receive only results, only techniques without understanding, will be able to use those techniques until they break, but they will not be able to repair them. They will not be able to adapt them to new circumstances. They will inherit capability without understanding. And capability without understanding is fragile. Third answer: recognize that we are part of a cycle, not the culmination of a progression. We are not the apex. We are not the endpoint. We are not the generation that finally figured everything out. We are one iteration in a long sequence. We are building on what we inherited. And what we build will be inherited by others. This does not diminish our importance. It contextualizes it. We are not responsible for solving every problem. We are responsible for leaving the world in a state where problems can be solved by those who come after. We are not responsible for achieving perfection. We are responsible for maintaining continuity. And continuity requires that we do not break the systems we depend on. Do not exhaust the resources faster than they can regenerate. Do not simplify the ecosystems beyond their capacity to recover. Do not destabilize the climate beyond the adaptive capacity of the species that depend on it. These are not grand ambitions. These are basic maintenance. We are the stewards of a planet we inherited, and stewardship means leaving it functional for the next inheritors. But there is a deeper question beneath all of this. If we accept that we are standing in the middle of the sequence, that others came before us and left traces we can barely detect, that complexity has risen and fallen multiple times, that the archaeological record is fragmentary and biased, what does this do to our sense of ourselves? Does it diminish us? To know that we are not the first, not the most advanced, possibly not even the most numerous that have ever existed? Or does it connect us? To know that we are part of an unbroken chain of inheritance and transformation, that we are linked to every human who has ever stood on this planet and tried to make sense of their place in it? I would suggest the latter. We are not diminished by the knowledge that others came before us. We are contextuated. We are not alone in time. We are part of a continuity, and that continuity is both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reminds us that we are temporary, that what we build will erode, that what we know will be forgotten, that we are not as important as we think we are. But empowering because it reminds us that we matter anyway, that our actions have consequences, that what we do will persist in some form and will shape the lives of those who come after. We are not the center of the story, but we are a chapter in it, and every chapter matters, even if it is never fully read. So here is what I want you to take from this. Not a conclusion, not a neat resolution, not a theory that explains everything, but a perspective, a way of seeing. When you look at the world around you, recognize that it is not natural. It is inherited. The forests are planted. The soil is engineered. The species are domesticated. The landscapes are managed, or were managed, or are recovering from management. Everything you see is a consequence. And consequences do not explain themselves. When you look at the past, recognize that what you can see is not representative. It is a filtered sample, biased toward the durable. Most of what happened left no trace. Most of who we were has returned to the soil, and the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is simply evidence of time. When you think about the future, recognize that you are creating consequences right now. Through your choices, through your practices, through what you preserve and what you consume, you are shaping the inheritance for those who come after. And you will not control how they interpret it. You will only control what they receive. This is the question I want you to leave with. Not what do I want to be remembered for, but what consequences am I creating? What am I changing? What am I preserving? What am I consuming? What will persist after I am gone? These are not comfortable questions. They do not have easy answers, but they are the questions that matter in deep time, because memory fades, records burn, names dissolve, but consequences persist, and consequences are inherited. We are standing on consequences, all the way down, and those who come after us will stand on the consequences we leave. So choose carefully, not what you say, not what you intend, not what you hope will be remembered. Choose what you do, because that is what will remain. In the comments, I do not want answers. I want questions. What would you need to survive if everything you knew was encoded only in practice, not in writing? What would you build to last 10,000 years, knowing that those who find it will not understand your language? What consequences are you creating right now that you have not thought about? Leave your questions, not your conclusions, because the questions are what we pass forward. The questions are the inheritance, and the next generation will answer them in ways we cannot predict. Just as we are answering questions left by those who came before us. Questions we did not even know they were asking, until we looked closely, until we saw the traces, until we recognized that we are standing on consequences.